The blizzard that hit Millbrook County in February 2019 was unlike anything residents had seen in decades. Winds howled at 90 miles per hour, temperatures plummeted to 28 below zero, and snow fell so thick it was like walking through a white wall. Most people had the sense to stay indoors, huddled around their fireplaces with emergency supplies. But Marcus Thompson wasn't most people. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Standing 7 feet 2 inches tall and weighing 340 pounds, Marcus was known throughout the county as the Giant. His massive frame cast shadows that could eclipse entire doorways, and his hands were so large they made basketballs look like tennis balls. But on that brutal February night, as he trudged through knee-deep snowdrifts along the abandoned stretch of Highway 47, Marcus would discover something that would change not only his life, but the entire fabric of Millbrook County forever. What he found buried beneath a pile of snow and debris would shock investigators, horrify the community, and ultimately reveal a web of secrets that had been festering in their small town for years. This is that story. Marcus Thompson had always been different. Born to parents of average height, his extraordinary growth had puzzled doctors since childhood. By age 12, he towered over his teachers. By 16, he had to duck through most doorways. Now at 34, he lived a largely solitary life in a custom-built cabin on the outskirts of Millbrook, working as a freelance carpenter, specializing in heavy construction projects that required his unique physical capabilities. People of Millbrook had grown accustomed to Marcus over the years, though he remained something of a local legend. Children would point and whisper when they saw him at the grocery store. Adults would nod politely, but keep their distance. It wasn't fear, exactly, but rather the natural human response to encountering someone so far outside the norm. Marcus had learned to accept this isolation, finding solace in his work and the quiet rhythms of rural life. On the evening of February 14th, Marcus had been working late in his workshop, crafting custom cabinets for the new Millbrook community center. The project was particularly meaningful to him. It was one of the few times the town had specifically sought out his services, recognizing that his strength and skill were exactly what they needed for the heavy timber construction. He'd been so absorbed in his work that he barely noticed when the wind began to howl around his cabin. By 9 o'clock, the storm had intensified dramatically. The power flickered once, twice, then died completely. Marcus lit his emergency lanterns and decided to call it a night, but as he prepared for bed, he heard something that made him pause, a sound that didn't belong to the storm. It was faint, almost lost in the wind, but unmistakably human. A cry for help. Marcus pulled on his heaviest coat, a custom-made parka that looked more like a tent than a jacket, and stepped out into the blizzard. The cold hit him like a physical blow, and the wind nearly knocked him off balance despite his size. Snow pelted his face so hard it stung, but he pressed forward, following what he thought might be the source of the sound. Highway 47 ran past his property, though it was rarely used except by locals taking the shortcut to the interstate. In weather like this, Marcus couldn't imagine anyone being foolish enough to attempt the route, but the cry had definitely come from that direction. He made his way toward the road, each step requiring tremendous effort as he fought against wind gusts that would have sent a normal-sized person tumbling. The snow on the highway was nearly waist-deep, broken only by the occasional drift that rose even higher. Marcus used his massive hands to clear a path, his breath forming clouds of vapor that were immediately swept away by the wind. He called out periodically, hoping to hear a response, but the storm seemed to swallow his voice. It was nearly 10:30 when he saw it, a dark shape partially buried beneath a massive snowdrift about 50 yards ahead. At first, Marcus thought it might be debris blown from someone's property, perhaps a shed roof or a section of fencing. But as he approached, fighting through snow that now reached his chest, he realized with growing horror that the shape was too regular, too purposeful to be random debris. It was a car. A small, dark sedan that had clearly been there for hours, judging by the amount of snow that had accumulated on and around it. The vehicle was positioned at an odd angle, as if it had skidded off the road and come to rest in the ditch. But what made Marcus's blood run cold was the realization that if there was a car here, there might be people inside, people who had been trapped in this storm for hours. Marcus attacked the snow around the car with desperate intensity, using his hands like shovels to clear away the drifts. The car was almost completely buried, with only a portion of the rear window visible. As he worked, he called out repeatedly, hoping to hear some sign of life from within. After 20 minutes of frantic digging, Marcus had cleared enough snow to see that the car had not simply slid off the road. The driver's side door was crumpled inward, the windshield was spider-webbed with cracks, and there were deep gouges along the passenger side that looked suspiciously like they might have been made by another vehicle. This hadn't been an accident caused by the storm. This car had been in a collision. Marcus finally managed to clear the driver's side door, enough to peer through the window. The interior was dark and appeared empty, but he could see that the front airbags had deployed. He tried the door handle, but the door was either locked or damaged beyond opening. Moving around to the passenger side, he found that door slightly ajar, though it was blocked by snow and debris. With careful but determined force, Marcus pried the passenger door open wide enough to look inside. The front seats were empty, but there were clear signs that the car had been occupied recently. A purse on the floor, a cell phone on the dashboard, and what looked like blood on the deflated airbag dot. It was then that Marcus heard it again, the sound that had originally drawn him out into the storm. A weak, barely audible moan coming from somewhere behind the car. He quickly made his way around the vehicle, and there, partially concealed beneath a pile of snow and what appeared to be a torn piece of fabric, he saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It was a young girl, probably no more than 8 or 9 years old, curled up in a fetal position and barely conscious. She was wearing only a thin nightgown that was now soaked through and partially frozen to her skin. Her dark hair was matted with snow, and what Marcus realized with growing horror was dried blood. Her face was swollen and discolored, marked by bruises that were clearly not from the car accident. Marcus knelt beside the girl, his massive frame shielding her from the worst of the wind. Up close, the extent of her injuries became even more apparent. She had been severely beaten, her left eye was swollen shut, her lip was split, and there were finger-shaped bruises around her throat that made Marcus's hands shake with rage. But she was alive. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, and when Marcus gently touched her shoulder, her remaining good eye fluttered open. She looked up at him with a mixture of terror and confusion, clearly struggling to focus. "It's okay," Marcus said softly, his deep voice barely audible above the wind. "You're going to be okay. I'm going to help you." The girl tried to speak, but only a weak whisper emerged. Marcus leaned closer, straining to hear her words above the storm. "Please," she managed to say, her voice barely more than a breath. "Don't let him find me." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. This child hadn't just been in a car accident. She had been running from someone. Someone who had hurt her badly enough to leave those terrible bruises, and who had frightened her so thoroughly that even in her current condition, her primary concern was not being found. Without hesitation, Marcus scooped the girl up in his arms, marveling at how light and fragile she felt against his massive frame. She was hypothermic and going into shock, and if he didn't get her warm and dry immediately, she wouldn't survive the night. The journey back to his cabin felt like it took hours, though it was probably only 15 minutes. Marcus cradled the girl against his chest, using his body to shield her from the wind and snow. She drifted in and out of consciousness during the trek, occasionally mumbling words that Marcus couldn't quite make out. Once inside his cabin, Marcus immediately set to work trying to save the girl's life. He had basic first aid training from his construction work, but nothing had prepared him for this. He wrapped her in warm blankets, started a fire in his fireplace, and tried to assess the full extent of her injuries by the light of his emergency lanterns. What he discovered made his hands clench into fists. The girl had been systematically beaten by someone much larger and stronger than her. The bruises on her arms and legs suggested she had tried to defend herself, and the marks around her throat indicated that someone had attempted to strangle her. Most disturbing of all, there were older bruises beneath the fresh ones, evidence that this had been going on for some time. Marcus tried calling 911 from his landline, but the phone was dead. The storm had knocked out all communication. His cell phone showed no signal, which wasn't unusual in this remote area even under normal conditions. He was completely cut off from the outside world, alone with a severely injured child who clearly needed immediate medical attention. As he worked to warm the girl and clean her wounds as gently as possible, Marcus found himself thinking about what she had said in the snow. "Don't let him find me." Who was she running from? And how had she ended up alone on a deserted highway in the middle of a blizzard, wearing nothing but a nightgown? The girl's condition began to stabilize somewhat as she warmed up. Her breathing became less labored, and she stopped shivering quite so violently. But she remained largely unconscious, stirring only occasionally to mumble incoherent words. It was around 2 in the morning when Marcus first heard the sound that would change everything. Over the howling of the wind, he detected the distant rumble of a vehicle engine. Someone was out there, driving slowly along Highway 47 despite the treacherous conditions. Marcus moved to his front window and peered out into the storm. Through the swirling snow, he could make out headlights moving back and forth along the highway, as if the driver was searching for something or someone. The girl stirred in her sleep, and even unconscious, she seemed to sense the danger. She began to whimper and curl up tighter in the blankets, as if trying to make herself invisible. The vehicle outside stopped directly across from Marcus's cabin. The headlights remained on, pointing toward his property, and Marcus could see a figure getting out of what appeared to be a large pickup truck. The person had a flashlight and was scanning the area on the buried car that Marcus had found earlier. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus's mind raced. This had to be connected to the girl. There was no other reason for someone to be out searching in these conditions. But the child's reaction, even in her unconscious state, told him everything he needed to know about whether this person's intentions were good or bad. The figure with the flashlight began walking toward Marcus's cabin, following the deep footprints that Marcus had left in the snow when he carried the girl to safety. Within minutes, there would be a knock on his door, and Marcus would have to decide what to do. As he watched the approaching figure, Marcus made a choice that would set in motion a series of events that would ultimately expose secrets, challenge everything the people of Millbrook thought they knew about their community, and transform Marcus from a gentle giant who just wanted to be left alone into something he had never expected to become: a protector, a fighter, and ultimately, a hero. But first, he had to survive the night. And he had to keep the promise he had made to a broken little girl in the snow. He would not let him find her, no matter what it cost. The knock came exactly as Marcus had expected: 3 sharp raps on his front door that somehow managed to sound threatening despite the howling wind. Marcus quickly moved the girl to his bedroom, wrapping her more securely in blankets and positioning her where she wouldn't be visible from the main living area. She was still unconscious, but her breathing had improved and some color had returned to her pale cheeks. Marcus took a deep breath and opened the door. Standing on his porch was a man in his early 40s, tall and lean with the kind of build that suggested he was used to physical work. He wore a sheriff's deputy uniform beneath, a heavy winter coat, and his badge caught the light from Marcus's lantern. But what struck Marcus most was the man's eyes, cold, calculating, and currently scanning the interior of Marcus's cabin with obvious suspicion. "Evening," the deputy said, his voice carrying an authority that seemed forced. "Deputy Wayne Hutchinson, Millbrook County Sheriff's Department. Sorry to bother you so late, but we've got a situation out here. Did you see anything unusual tonight?" Marcus studied the man carefully. There was something off about him. His uniform looked legitimate enough, but his manner was wrong. Real law enforcement officers Marcus had encountered were professional, but approachable. This man radiated an undercurrent of barely controlled aggression. "Just the storm," Marcus replied, keeping his voice neutral. "Pretty rough night to be out driving." Deputy Hutchinson's eyes narrowed slightly. "Yeah, well, we got a report of a missing child. 8-year-old girl named Sophie Brennan went missing from her home earlier tonight. Family's worried sick." He paused, watching Marcus's reaction carefully. "You wouldn't happen to have seen a little girl wandering around out here, would you?" The way he said it, casual, almost dismissive, sent warning signals through Marcus's mind. If this man was genuinely searching for a missing child, he would be showing more urgency, more concern. Instead, he seemed to be going through the motions of an official search while his attention remained focused on getting inside Marcus's cabin. "No, I haven't seen anyone," Marcus said firmly. "Been working in my shop most of the evening until the power went out." Hutchinson nodded slowly, but his hand moved to rest on his service weapon. "Mind if I take a look around? Just to be thorough. Little girl could be hurt, hiding somewhere. You know how kids are when they're scared." Marcus felt his muscles tense. Every instinct he had was screaming that this man was dangerous, that letting him inside would be a mistake. But refusing a law enforcement officer's request could escalate the situation in ways that might put the girl in even greater danger. "Of course," Marcus said, stepping aside. "Though I don't know where a child could hide in here that I wouldn't have noticed." Hutchinson entered the cabin, his movements quick and predatory. He wasn't searching for a missing child, he was hunting. His eyes swept every corner, every shadow, and Marcus noticed that his hand never moved far from his weapon. The deputy made a show of checking the main room, the kitchen, and even Marcus's workshop, but Marcus could tell his heart wasn't in the search. Hutchinson was stalling, trying to figure out if the girl was here and how to handle Marcus if she was. "You live out here all alone?" Hutchinson asked, turning back toward Marcus with that same cold smile. "I prefer the quiet," Marcus replied. "I bet you do." Hutchinson's tone had shifted, becoming more openly hostile. "You know, it's funny. I was checking out that car accident back on the highway, and I found some interesting tracks in the snow. Big tracks, real big, leading right up to your front door." Marcus kept his expression neutral, but internally he was calculating distances and angles. Hutchinson was armed and clearly dangerous, but Marcus had advantages of his own. The question was whether he could neutralize the threat without putting the girl at greater risk. "Like I said, I was in my workshop until the power went out," Marcus said. "I stepped outside to check my generator when I heard what sounded like someone calling for help. I walked down toward the road to see if anyone needed assistance, but didn't find anything. Tracks probably got covered by the snow by now." It was a reasonable explanation, but Hutchinson wasn't buying it. He began moving toward the hallway that led to Marcus's bedroom, and Marcus knew he was out of time. "Actually," Marcus said, stepping into Hutchinson's path, "I think you should probably head back out there and continue your search. The weather's only getting worse." Hutchinson stopped and turned to face Marcus fully. For the first time, the pretense of official duty dropped completely from his demeanor. "You know what I think? I think you found something out there that doesn't belong to you. And I think you need to hand it over before this gets complicated." "I don't know what you're talking about," Marcus said, but he was already shifting his weight, preparing for what was about to happen. Hutchinson drew his weapon in one smooth motion, pointing it directly at Marcus's chest. "Last chance, Giant. Where is she?" The gun looked small in comparison to Marcus's massive frame, but Marcus knew that firearms were great equalizers. Still, something about Hutchinson's stance and grip suggested he wasn't as comfortable with the weapon as a real law enforcement officer should be. There were details that didn't add up. His holster was wrong. His badge was slightly off-center, and most importantly, he hadn't followed proper protocol for any part of this encounter. "You're not really a deputy, are you?" Marcus said quietly. Hutchinson's smile was ugly and predatory. "Smart man. Too bad smart isn't going to help you right now. See, little Sophie Brennan is my daughter, and she's been a very bad girl tonight. Ran away from home right in the middle of a family discussion about proper behavior. Now I need to bring her back home so we can finish our conversation." The casual way he described what was clearly child abuse made Marcus's vision go red around the edges. This man, this monster, was the one who had beaten that little girl so severely. He was the source of her terror, the reason she would rather risk freezing to death in a blizzard than stay in his house. "She's not going anywhere." "With you," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. Hutchinson laughed. "You think that size makes you bulletproof? I got 6 rounds in this gun, and at this range, I can put all of them center mass before you take 2 steps. What Hutchinson didn't understand was that Marcus had spent years working construction, including demolition projects where split-second timing could mean the difference between life and death. He had developed reflexes that most people his size simply didn't possess. And right now, those reflexes were telling him exactly how this was going to play out. Marcus lunged forward and to his left, just as Hutchinson pulled the trigger. The gunshot was deafeningly loud in the confined space of the cabin, and Marcus felt the bullet pass close enough to his right shoulder that it tore through his shirt. But he was already inside Hutchinson's guard, his massive hand closing around the man's wrist with enough force to make bones creak. Hutchinson tried to bring the gun around for a second shot, but Marcus twisted his wrist sharply to the right. There was a wet snapping sound, and Hutchinson screamed as his wrist broke. The gun clattered to the floor, sliding across the room and out of reach. Marcus could have ended it right there. His anger at what this man had done to the girl was a living thing inside his chest, demanding retribution. It would have been easy to close his hands around Hutchinson's throat and squeeze until the light went out of those cold, calculating eyes, but Marcus wasn't a killer. Despite his size and strength, despite the rage coursing through his veins, he was fundamentally a good man who believed in doing the right thing. So instead of crushing Hutchinson's windpipe, Marcus simply lifted him off the ground with one hand and carried him to the front door. "You're going to leave," Marcus said, his voice deadly calm. "You're going to get in your truck, and you're going to drive away. And if I ever see you near that little girl again, I won't be so gentle next time." Hutchinson was cradling his broken wrist against his chest, his face pale with pain and shock. But the malice in his eyes hadn't dimmed. "You have no idea who you're messing with. Sophie belongs to me. She's my property, and I will get her back." Marcus opened the front door, letting the wind and snow blow into the cabin. "No," he said simply, "she doesn't." He tossed Hutchinson out into the storm like a man throwing out a bag of garbage. Hutchinson landed hard in the snow, rolled once, and came up sputtering and cursing. But he was smart enough not to try to continue the fight. Clutching his broken wrist, he stumbled toward his truck. Marcus watched until the vehicle's taillights disappeared into the storm, then quickly barricaded his front door with a heavy wooden beam he normally used for construction projects. Hutchinson would be back, probably with reinforcements, and Marcus needed time to figure out his next move. He checked on Sophie and found that she had awakened during the confrontation. She was sitting up in bed, her good eye wide with fear, clearly having Heard the gunshot and the struggle. Is he gone? She whispered. For now, Marcus said gently, sitting down carefully on the edge of the bed so as not to frighten her further with his sighs. Sophie, I need you to tell me what happened. Who is Wayne Hutchinson to you? Sophie's face crumpled and she began to cry quietly. He's my stepfather. He hurts me all the time. Mama knows, but she's too scared to stop him. Tonight he was really angry because I spilled juice on his newspaper, and he started hitting me harder than usual. I got away and ran to the car. But he followed me and... She touched the bruises on her throat. He choked me until I passed out. When I woke up, I was in the car, and we were driving somewhere. I think he was going to ... going to get rid of me. Marcus felt that familiar. Rage building again, but he forced it down. Sophie needed comfort and protection, not more violence. What happened to the car? Another car hit us, Sophie said. Wayne got out to check on the other driver, and I heard him yelling. There was a fight, and then I heard a gunshot. Wayne came back to the car, but he was bleeding and really mad. He pulled me out and started dragging me through the snow, saying he was going to bury me where no one would ever find me. But the storm got really bad, and I think he got confused about where we were. He left me by the side of the road and said he was going to get tools from his truck. That's when I ran. The picture was becoming clearer, and it was even worse then. Marcus had imagined. Hutchinson hadn't just been abusing Sophie. He had been planning to murder her. The car accident had probably saved her life by disrupting his plans, giving her the chance to escape into the storm. Sophie, do you have any other family? Grandparents, aunts or uncles? Anyone who could take care of you? Sophie shook her head. Mama's parents died when I was little. Daddy's parents live in California, but I don't know their address. Wayne always said if I ever told anyone about what he did, he would hurt them too. Marcus was quiet for a moment, processing this information. Sophie was completely alone, except for a mother who was too terrified to protect her and a stepfather who was actively trying to kill her. The normal channels, calling the police, contacting Child Protective Services, weren't options in the middle of a blizzard. Even if they were, Marcus wasn't sure he could trust local law enforcement. Hutchinson had been wearing what looked like a legitimate uniform, which suggested he either was actually a deputy or had access to official equipment. Sophie, I want you to know that you're safe here, Marcus said finally. Wayne Hutchinson is never going to hurt you again. I promise you that. Sophie looked up at him with an expression that was far too old for her young face. How can you promise that? He always finds me when I try to hide. And he's stronger than everyone else, Marcus smiled grimly. He's not stronger than me. Over the next several hours, as the storm continued to rage outside, Marcus worked on making his cabin as secure as possible. He reinforced the doors and windows, moved his heaviest tools within easy reach, and prepared several defensive positions throughout the building. If Hutchinson came back, and Marcus was certain he would, Marcus intended to be ready. Sophie slept fitfully, waking frequently from nightmares. Each time, Marcus was there to reassure her, his gentle voice and protective presence gradually helping her to relax. Despite everything she had been through, she was beginning to trust him, perhaps sensing that for the first time in her young life, she had found someone who was truly on her side. As dawn approached, Marcus began planning for the longer term. The storm would eventually end, communications would be restored, and the outside world would intrude on their temporary sanctuary. When that happened, Marcus knew he would need allies, people who could help him protect Sophie and bring Hutchinson to justice. But first, he had to survive whatever Hutchinson had planned for his return. Because Marcus was certain of one thing: a man like Wayne Hutchinson didn't give up easily, especially when his freedom, and possibly his life, depended on silencing the only witness to his crimes. The real battle was just beginning. Dawn brought no relief from the storm, But it did bring Marcus his first glimpse of just how deep the conspiracy surrounding Sophie's abuse actually ran. As gray morning light filtered through his windows, Marcus spotted not one, but 3 vehicles parked along Highway 47, their occupants clearly coordinating some kind of operation. Marcus used his binoculars to get a better look at the gathering. Hutchinson was there, his left arm now in a crude sling, talking animatedly with 4 other men. 2 were wearing what appeared to be sheriff's department uniforms, while the others were dressed in civilian clothes but carried themselves with the bearing of law enforcement officers. What disturbed Marcus most was how organized they seemed. This wasn't a desperate father searching for his missing child. This was a coordinated cover-up involving multiple people who should have been protecting Sophie, not helping to hunt her down. Sophie was awake and sitting at Marcus's kitchen table, slowly eating a bowl of oatmeal he'd prepared for her. The swelling around her eye had gone down slightly, but the bruises had darkened overnight, creating a horrific map of violence across her small face. "There are more of them now," Marcus said quietly, setting down the binoculars. Sophie's spoon froze halfway to her mouth. "How many?" "5 men. 2 more deputies and 2 others." Marcus studied her reaction carefully. "Sophie, does Wayne have friends in the sheriff's department?" Sophie nodded miserably. "He plays poker with them every Friday night. Deputy Rodriguez, Deputy Mason, and Sheriff Garrett himself. They all come to our house, and they know what Wayne does to me. Sometimes they joke about it." Marcus felt his stomach drop. If the sheriff himself was involved, then the corruption went all the way to the top of local law enforcement. Calling for help through official channels wasn't just impossible, it would be actively dangerous. "They've seen Wayne hit me before," Sophie continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "One time Deputy Rodriguez said I probably deserved it for being mouthy. Another time, Sheriff Garrett told Wayne he needed to keep his property in line better." The casual dehumanization in those statements made Marcus's hands clench into fists. These were sworn officers of the law, people entrusted with protecting the innocent, and they were treating a child like she was livestock. Through the window, Marcus watched the group begin to move. 3 of the men headed toward his cabin, while the other 2 took positions that would allow them to cover the back of his property. They were setting up a perimeter, treating this like a military operation rather than a welfare check. "Sophie, I need you to hide," Marcus said, his voice calm but urgent. "There's a storage space under my workshop floor. It's where I keep my emergency supplies. You'll be safe there no matter what happens." Sophie's good eye filled with tears. "What?" "About you. They'll hurt you because you helped me." Marcus knelt down so he was at eye level with the little girl. "Sophie, I want you to understand something. I'm not going to let them take you. Not today, not ever. But I need you to trust me and do exactly what I say, okay?" Sophie nodded, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. Marcus led her quickly to his workshop and showed her the hidden compartment he'd built years ago as a tornado shelter. It was well concealed beneath a heavy workbench and stocked with water, food, and blankets. "No matter what you hear, don't come out until I come get you personally," Marcus instructed. "If someone else tries to get you to come out, even if they say I sent them, you stay hidden. Can you do that for me?" "I can do that, Sophie," said her voice stronger now. Despite everything she'd been through, she was showing remarkable courage. Marcus helped her down into the shelter and replaced the concealed floor panel just as the first knock came at his front door. This time it was much more aggressive, the sharp, demanding rap of people who weren't planning to take no for an answer. Marcus opened the door to find Sheriff Garrett himself standing on his porch, flanked by deputies Rodriguez and Mason. Garrett was a heavy-set man in his 50s with graying hair and the kind of face that should have inspired trust. Instead, Marcus found himself looking into eyes that were just as cold and calculating as Hutchinson's had been. "Morning, Mr. Thompson," Sheriff Garrett said, his tone professionally polite but underlaid with unmistakable threat. "I believe you." "Met Deputy Hutchinson last night." "I met someone claiming to be Deputy Hutchinson," Marcus replied carefully, though his behavior wasn't very professional. Sheriff Garrett smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Wayne tells me you assaulted a law enforcement officer and are harboring a fugitive." "That's serious business, Mr. Thompson." "Fugitive?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "I thought you were looking for a missing child." "Sophie Brennan is wanted in connection with the death of her mother," Deputy Rodriguez interjected. "Happened last night during a domestic disturbance. We have reason to believe she may be armed and dangerous." It was a smooth lie, delivered with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to manipulating the truth. Marcus had no doubt that if Sophie's mother was indeed dead, it was Hutchinson who had killed her, probably to prevent her from talking about the abuse. "That's quite a story," Marcus said. 8-year-old Sophie Brennan, armed and dangerous. "I'm sure that'll play well with the state investigators." Sheriff Garrett's expression hardened. "There won't be any state investigators, Mr. Thompson. This is a local matter, and we handle our own problems here in Millbrook County. Now, I'm going to ask you one time, where is the girl?" Marcus stepped back and began to close the door. "I think this conversation is over. If you have an official warrant, you can show it to me. Otherwise, you're trespassing." Deputy Mason moved forward, placing his boot against the door to prevent Marcus from closing it. "We don't need a warrant to pursue a dangerous fugitive, especially when we have probable cause to believe she's being harbored by someone who assaulted a police officer." Marcus looked down at the deputy's boot, then back up at Mason's face. "Move your foot." There was something in Marcus's voice, a quiet, deadly certainty that made Mason hesitate. The deputy was used to intimidating people through his authority and his badge, but he was suddenly faced with someone who wasn't impressed by either. "I said move your foot," Marcus repeated, his voice dropping to that dangerous rumble again. Mason glanced at Sheriff Garrett, looking for guidance. Garrett nodded slightly, and Mason reluctantly stepped back. But as Marcus began to close the door again, Sheriff Garrett spoke up. "Mr. Thompson, I think there's something you need to understand about the situation you're in. Wayne Hutchinson is Sophie Brennan's legal guardian. He has every right to reclaim his stepdaughter, and anyone who interferes with that is breaking the law. But more than that, you're interfering with people who have a lot of friends in this county. People who could make your life very, very difficult." Marcus paused with the door half closed. "Are you threatening me, Sheriff?" "I'm informing you of the consequences of your actions. Your business license, your permits, your property taxes. All of these things go through county offices staffed by people who trust our judgment. It would be a shame if bureaucratic problems started making it impossible for you to earn a living here." It was a threat, but couched in language that gave Garrett plausible deniability. Marcus recognized the tactic, the same kind of institutional pressure that had probably kept Sophie's abuse hidden for years. People who might have helped were scared into silence by the threat of professional and personal retaliation. "I'll keep that in mind," Marcus said, and closed the door firmly. He watched through his window as the 3 officers retreated to confer with the other 2 men. Their body language suggested they were arguing about how to proceed. Marcus used the time to prepare for the next phase of the confrontation, which he was certain would be more direct. Marcus had been thinking about this situation all morning, and he'd come to a disturbing conclusion. The level of coordination and the willingness to fabricate serious criminal charges suggested that Sophie's case wasn't an isolated incident. A corrupt sheriff's department didn't typically organize itself around protecting one abusive stepfather. It organized itself around protecting a pattern of abuse that probably involved multiple victims. 20 minutes later, Marcus's theory was confirmed when he saw Hutchinson approaching the cabin alone, carrying what appeared to be a gasoline can and a road flare. The message was clear: if Marcus wouldn't hand over Sophie voluntarily, They were prepared to burn down his cabin with both of them inside. Marcus had prepared for this possibility. His cabin was equipped with a sophisticated sprinkler system that he'd installed after a workshop fire several years earlier. More importantly, he'd spent the morning preparing a surprise for anyone who tried to use arson as a weapon against him. Hutchinson made no attempt at subtlety. He simply walked up to the side of the cabin and began splashing gasoline against the exterior walls. Marcus waited until Hutchinson had emptied most of the can, then triggered the sprinkler system. Water cascaded down from hidden nozzles built into the cabin's eaves, instantly diluting the gasoline and soaking Hutchinson in the process. But Marcus had made one modification to his sprinkler system for this particular situation. Instead of just water, the system was now pumping out a mixture of water and the fire-retardant foam he used in his workshop. Hutchinson found himself covered in a thick, soapy substance that made it impossible to get a grip on anything and extremely difficult to see. He stumbled backward, cursing and trying to wipe the foam from his eyes, just as Marcus opened his front door. "Problem, Wayne?" Marcus called out. Hutchinson spun around, still partially blinded by the foam. "You think you're real clever, don't you, giant? But this ends today. One way or another, Sophie comes with me." "Actually," Marcus said, stepping out onto his porch, "I don't think she does." Marcus had used the morning hours for more than just preparing defenses. He'd also been thinking about the legal and practical aspects of his situation. Wayne Hutchinson claimed to be Sophie's legal guardian, but was he really? And even if he was, did that give him the right to abuse and attempt to murder her? "I've been doing some thinking, Wayne," Marcus continued conversationally. "See, you claim to be Sophie's stepfather, but I'm wondering if that's actually true. Because if you were really married to her mother, and if her mother really was killed last night, then wouldn't there be paperwork? Death certificates, custody documents, that sort of thing." Hutchinson's expression shifted, becoming warier. "What's your point?" "My point is that I think you're lying about everything. I think Sophie's mother is probably still alive, probably locked up somewhere and too terrified to call for help. I think your claim to be her guardian is bogus. And I think you and your friends in the sheriff's department are running some kind of operation that involves abusing children and covering it up." The accuracy of Marcus's guess was confirmed by the way Hutchinson's face went white beneath the foam. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I think I do. And I think when this storm clears and outside agencies start investigating, you're all going to have a lot of explaining to do." Hutchinson reached inside his coat and pulled out a second gun. Apparently, he'd learned from their previous encounter and come better prepared. But this time, Marcus was ready for him. Marcus had positioned himself next to one of the support posts for his porch roof, a massive timber that could stop rifle rounds. As Hutchinson raised his weapon, Marcus stepped behind the post and grabbed the emergency fire axe he'd mounted there that morning. The first gunshot splintered wood inches from Marcus's head. The second shot went wide as Marcus moved laterally along his porch, using the various support structures for cover. By the third shot, Marcus was close enough to act. The fire axe caught Hutchinson's gun hand at the wrist. The impact was devastating. Bones shattered, tendons severed, and the gun went flying across the yard. Hutchinson screamed and fell to his knees, clutching the remains of his right hand. Marcus looked down at the broken man and felt nothing but disgust. "You like hurting people who can't fight back, don't you, Wayne? How does it feel when someone fights back?" The other 4 men were running toward the cabin now, having heard the gunshots. Marcus glanced at them, calculating odds and distances. 4 armed men against 1, even with his size advantage, was not good math. But Marcus had one more surprise prepared. During his years in construction, Marcus had worked on several projects that involved controlled demolitions. He understood explosives, and more importantly, he understood how to use them safely and effectively. That morning, while preparing his defenses, he'd rigged several small charges around his property. Nothing that would hurt anyone, but enough to create chaos and confusion. As the four men approached his cabin in a tactical formation, Marcus triggered the first charge. The explosion wasn't large, but it sent up a massive cloud of snow and debris that temporarily blinded the approaching men and covered Marcus's retreat into his workshop. From there, he could access the underground passage he'd built to his emergency shelter, the same shelter where Sophie was hiding. It was time to evacuate and move to phase 2 of his plan, because Marcus Thompson, the gentle giant who just wanted to be left alone, had decided that some things were worth fighting for, and he was prepared to take this fight as far as it needed to go. The underground passage Marcus had built connected his workshop to a natural cave system that extended deep into the hillside behind his property. What the corrupt deputies didn't know was that these caves had been used during the Civil War as part of the Underground Railroad, and Marcus had spent years exploring and mapping every tunnel and chamber. Sophie was waiting in the emergency shelter when Marcus arrived through the concealed entrance. Her eyes widened when she saw him covered in dirt and debris from the explosion. "Are you hurt?" she asked immediately. Marcus was struck by her concern for him despite everything she'd been through. "I'm fine, sweetheart. But we need to move. Can you walk okay?" Sophie nodded and took his offered hand. Marcus led her deeper into the cave system, following a route he'd memorized years ago. Behind them, he could hear shouting and the sound of men searching his cabin. But the entrance to the caves was so well concealed that it would take them hours to find it, if they ever did. The caves were cold but dry, and Marcus had stashed emergency supplies in several locations over the years. More importantly, they led to an exit nearly a mile away on the far side of Pine Ridge, where Marcus kept a secondary workshop and a truck that the deputies didn't know about. As they moved through the tunnels, Sophie told Marcus more about the scope of the abuse she'd witnessed and endured. The picture that emerged was even more horrifying than Marcus had imagined. "Wayne doesn't just hurt me," Sophie whispered as they navigated a narrow passage. "There are other kids too. Sometimes they bring them to our house. Kids who don't have families or whose families can't protect them. They keep them in the basement." Marcus stopped walking, his blood running cold. "How many children, Sophie?" "I don't know exactly. They move them around a lot. But I've seen at least 6 different kids over the past year. Some of them ... Sophie's voice broke. "Some of them don't come back upstairs." Marcus knelt down in front of Sophie, his massive frame filling the tunnel. "Sophie, I need you to tell me everything you can remember about these other children. Names, ages, anything that might help us find them." Over the next 20 minutes, as they continued through the caves, Sophie provided details that painted a picture of a systematic child trafficking operation. The corrupt sheriff's department wasn't just covering up Wayne Hutchinson's abuse of his stepdaughter. They were actively participating in a network that kidnapped, abused, and apparently murdered vulnerable children. "They have a place outside town," Sophie continued. "An old farm that's supposed to be abandoned. But there are always cars there at night. Wayne took me there once to show me what happens to little girls who don't cooperate. There were cages in the barn, and kids locked inside them." Marcus's hands were shaking with rage, but he forced himself to stay focused. This was bigger than just saving Sophie. There were other children in immediate danger, and every moment they delayed meant more suffering. They reached Marcus's secondary workshop just as the sun was setting. The building was smaller than his main cabin, but equally well equipped, and it contained something that Marcus was going to need for what came next: a powerful radio system he'd installed for emergency communications. Marcus's background in construction had required him to work with various government agencies over the years, and he'd maintained contacts with state-level law enforcement through his involvement in disaster relief operations. If he could reach the right people, he might be able to bypass the local corruption entirely. But first, he needed to gather evidence. Sophie's testimony would be crucial, but it wouldn't be enough on its own. He needed documentation, physical proof, and ideally, he needed to rescue the other children before Hutchinson and his allies could move or eliminate them. Marcus powered up his radio and began scanning for state police frequencies. The storm was beginning to clear, which meant communication was becoming possible again. But it also meant that Hutchinson's group would soon be able to call for backup from outside the county. After 20 minutes of careful frequency selection, Marcus made contact with Captain Jennifer Walsh of the Pennsylvania State Police. He'd worked with Captain Walsh 2 years earlier when a bridge collapse had required coordinated emergency response, and he knew she was both competent and honest. Captain Walsh, this is Marcus Thompson in Millbrook County. I have an emergency situation involving child endangerment and potential homicide by members of the local sheriff's department. There was a pause before Captain Walsh responded. Marcus, is that really you? We've been getting some strange reports from Millbrook County. Sheriff Garrett called this morning claiming you'd kidnapped a child and were holding her hostage. Captain, I need you to listen carefully. I'm going to tell you something that's going to sound unbelievable, but I have a witness and I'm prepared to provide evidence. Over the next 15 minutes, Marcus laid out everything he'd learned about the corruption in the sheriff's department and the child trafficking operation. He could hear Captain Walsh taking notes, occasionally asking for clarification on specific details. Marcus, if what you're telling me is true, this is going to require a massive coordinated response. But I need more than the testimony of one traumatized child. Can you get me physical evidence? I'm working on that, Marcus replied. But Captain, there are children being held at a location outside Millbrook right now. How quickly can you get a response team here? Weather's still bad on the interstate, but I can have a tactical team there within 3 hours. Can you hold out that long? Marcus looked at Sophie, who was listening to the conversation with wide eyes. We'll make it work. But Captain, you need to understand that the entire local law enforcement structure is compromised. Sheriff Garrett, at least 3 of his deputies, and probably others are all involved. Don't trust anyone from the Millbrook County Sheriff's Department. Understood. Marcus, I'm going to give you a secure radio frequency. Check in every 30 minutes until my team arrives. And Marcus, be careful. If these people are as dangerous as you say they are, they'll do anything to stop you from exposing them. After signing off with Captain Walsh, Marcus turned his attention to planning his next move. The state police would handle the official investigation and arrests, but the children being held at the abandoned farm couldn't wait 3 hours. Marcus was going to have to rescue them himself. Sophie, I need you to draw me a map of that farm where they keep the other children. Everything you can remember, buildings, roads, where the guards usually are. Sophie took a piece of paper and began sketching with the careful precision of a child who had learned to pay attention to details in order to survive. Her map showed a farmhouse, a large barn, several outbuildings, and a single access road that connected to the main highway. There are usually 2 men with guns, Sophie added. They stay in the farmhouse most of the time, but they check on the kids in the barn every couple of hours. And Marcus ... are dogs. Mean ones. Marcus studied the map, formulating a plan. He had advantages that the traffickers wouldn't expect: his size, his knowledge of the terrain, and most importantly, the element of surprise. They would be expecting him to run or hide, not to go on the offensive. Marcus's secondary workshop contained equipment he'd accumulated over years of construction and demolition work. In addition to standard tools, he had items that could be repurposed for tactical operations, industrial climbing gear, explosive charges for controlled demolitions, and even a few items he'd acquired during his brief stint in the National Guard 20 years earlier. Sophie, I need you to stay here, where it's safe, Marcus said as he began loading a backpack with equipment. Captain Walsh's team will be here in a few hours, and they'll take you somewhere where Wayne and his friends can never hurt you again." Sophie grabbed his arm with both hands. "Don't leave me alone. What if they find this place?" Marcus knelt down and took her small hands in his massive ones. "Sophie, those other children need help right now. I'm the only one who can get to them before something terrible happens. But I promise you, I will come back for you." Sophie stared into his eyes for a long moment, then nodded reluctantly. "The dogs are really mean," she said quietly. "And the men have big guns." "I'll be careful," Marcus promised. As darkness fell over Millbrook County, Marcus Thompson prepared to do something he'd never imagined he would have to do. He was going to wage a one-man war against a criminal organization that had been terrorizing children with impunity. He was going to prove that sometimes, when the system fails, ordinary people have to become extraordinary. Marcus loaded his truck with carefully selected equipment and checked his radio one more time. Captain Walsh's tactical team was still 2 hours out, which meant he was on his own for the most dangerous part of this operation. The abandoned Hartwell Farm was 12 miles from Marcus's secondary workshop, accessible by back roads that would keep him away from the main highway where Hutchinson's people might be watching. Marcus had driven past the property several times over the years and remembered it as a rundown operation that had been foreclosed on during the financial crisis. A decade earlier. As he drove through the dark countryside, Marcus thought about the children he was going to rescue. Sophie had described kids as young as 5 or 6, some who had been missing for months. They would be terrified, probably malnourished, and definitely traumatized. Rescuing them was only the first step. They would need medical attention, psychological support, and safe placement away from the people who had hurt them. But first, Marcus had to get them out alive. And that meant dealing with armed guards, attack dogs, and a criminal organization that had shown they were willing to kill to protect their secrets. The farm appeared in his headlights exactly as Sophie had described it, a cluster of dark buildings surrounded by overgrown fields. Marcus parked his truck a quarter-mile away and approached on foot, using the natural cover provided by a tree line that ran along the property's eastern boundary. From his concealed position, Marcus could see lights in the farmhouse in movement. Behind the windows, there were 3 vehicles parked near the main building, more than Sophie had mentioned, which meant either additional guards or a meeting in progress. Marcus activated his radio for a scheduled check-in with Captain Walsh. "This is Marcus. I'm at the target location, confirming presence of multiple subjects and vehicles." "Marcus, my team is 90 minutes out. I strongly advise you to maintain surveillance only until we arrive." "Understood, Captain. But if the situation changes, I may have to act." Marcus disconnected and continued his reconnaissance. Using binoculars, he could see into the farmhouse windows well enough to count at least 5 men inside. 2 were in sheriff's department uniforms, while the others appeared to be civilians. They seemed to be having some kind of heated discussion, gesturing animatedly and occasionally pointing toward the barn. The barn was where Sophie had said the children were kept, and Marcus could see a faint light coming from one of the small windows near the roof. As he watched, one of the men from the farmhouse walked to the barn, unlocked a heavy door, and disappeared inside for several minutes before returning to the house. Marcus was running out of time. Whatever was happening inside that farmhouse, it was building towards some kind of resolution. And if these men decided to eliminate evidence, including the children, Marcus might be the only thing standing between those kids and death. He checked his equipment one more time, said a silent prayer, and began moving toward the barn. The real battle was about to begin. Marcus moved through the darkness with surprising stealth for someone his size. Years of construction work had taught him how to move quietly on unstable surfaces, and the skills translated well to covert operations. He approached the barn from the blind side, away from the farmhouse windows, using a drainage ditch to conceal his approach. The barn was older than the other buildings, constructed of weathered wood that creaked ominously in the wind. Marcus could hear sounds from inside, not the voices of adults, but the soft whimpering of terrified children. The sound made his blood boil, but he forced himself to remain calm and methodical. Marcus circled the barn, noting two entrances: the main door that faced the farmhouse, and a smaller side door that appeared to be secured with a simple padlock. The windows were too high and too small for easy access, but they would allow him to see inside before he committed to entering. A small stepladder he'd brought from his truck. Marcus positioned himself beneath one of the windows and carefully peered inside. What he saw made him want to tear the building apart with his bare hands. The barn had been converted into a makeshift prison. Steel cages, each barely large enough for a child to lie down, were arranged in 2 rows down the center of the building. Marcus counted 8 cages, 6 of which contained children ranging in age from what looked like 5 to 12 years old. The children were dirty, obviously malnourished, and showed clear signs of physical abuse. A single guard sat in a chair near the main door, reading a magazine and occasionally glancing at the cages with bored indifference. He was armed with a Wazia pistol in a shoulder holster and had the soft, overfed look of someone who enjoyed having power over those weaker than himself. Marcus studied the layout carefully. The cages appeared to be secured with simple padlocks, which he could deal with easily. The main challenge would be neutralizing the guard quietly enough to avoid alerting the men in the farmhouse, then getting 6 traumatized children to safety before backup arrived. Marcus climbed down from the window and moved to the side door. The padlock was heavy but old, designed more to keep children in than to keep determined adults out. Marcus used a small hydraulic cutter from his toolkit, a device designed for cutting rebar and steel cable, to snap the padlock with barely a whisper of sound. The door opened on well-oiled hinges, confirming Marcus's suspicion that this facility had been in operation for some time. He slipped inside, moving along the wall toward the guard's position. The children in the nearest cages saw him, and their eyes widened with a mixture of hope and fear. Marcus held a finger to his lips, signaling for silence, then pointed toward the guard. The children understood immediately and shrank back into their cages, pretending to sleep. The guard never saw Marcus coming. One moment he was reading his magazine, the next he was unconscious on the floor with Marcus's massive hand still positioned where his carotid artery had been. Marcus quickly tied the guard's hands and feet, then gagged him with duct tape. The man would live, but he wouldn't be causing any problems. "It's okay," Marcus whispered to the children as he began working on the first cage lock. "I'm here to get you out. We need to be very quiet, okay?" The first child he freed was a boy of about 7 with sandy hair and hollow, frightened eyes. "Are you the police?" the boy whispered. "I'm someone who's going to make sure you're safe," Marcus replied, moving to the next cage. "What's your name?" Tommy Carlisle. I've been here for ... I don't know how long." "Are my parents looking for me?" Marcus's heart clenched, but he kept his voice steady. "I'm sure they are, Tommy, and we're going to get you back to them." As Marcus freed each child, he learned their names and how long they'd been missing. Emma Rodriguez, age 8, had been gone for 4 months. Michael Chun, age 6, had been taken from a playground 3 weeks ago. Sarah Williams, age 9, had been missing for over a year. Each story was a testament to the scope and duration of this criminal operation, but it was the last child that broke Marcus's heart completely. Lisa Brennan, Sophie's 6-year-old half-sister, looked exactly like Sophie, but even more damaged. She had been here the longest, over 18 months, and barely seemed to register that she was being rescued. "Lisa," Marcus whispered gently, "Sophie sent me to find you. She's safe now, and you're going to be safe too." For the first time, Lisa's eyes showed a spark of recognition. Sophie's alive. She's alive and she's waiting for you." Marcus confirmed. Marcus gathered the 6 children near the side door, quickly assessing their physical condition. They were all weak from malnutrition and showed signs of various injuries, but they seemed capable of walking. The bigger challenge would be moving them across open ground to his truck without being detected. Marcus was about to lead the children outside when he heard vehicles approaching the farmhouse. Through the barn window, he could see headlights. Turning into the driveway, at least 2 additional vehicles, possibly more. Marcus keyed his radio, keeping his voice low. "Captain Walsh, this is Marcus. I've located 6 children at the target location, but we have a problem. Multiple additional subjects just arrived. I count at least 10 people on site now." Captain Walsh's voice crackled back immediately. "Marcus, get those children out of there now. We're 45 minutes away, but I'm calling for helicopter support. Can you reach a safe extraction point?" Marcus looked at the 6 frightened children huddled around him. The original plan of walking them back to his truck was no longer viable. There were too many people arriving, and the children were too weak to move quickly across rough terrain. "Negative on extraction to my vehicle," Marcus radioed back. "Too many hostiles, and the children can't move fast enough. I'm going to have to find an alternative." Marcus thought quickly about the geography of the area. The Hartwell farm backed up against state forest land, and he knew there was an old logging road about half a mile into the woods. If he could get the children to that road, Captain Walsh's helicopter could potentially extract them directly. But first, he had to get them out of the barn without being detected. The arrival of additional vehicles had triggered a flurry of activity around the farmhouse. Marcus could see men moving back and forth past the windows, and it was only a matter of time before someone came to check on the children. Marcus gathered the children close to him. "Listen carefully," he whispered. "We're going to leave here very quietly. I need everyone to hold hands and follow me exactly. If I tell you to stop, you stop. If I tell you to run, you run as fast as you can. Can you do that?" 6 small heads nodded in unison. Despite their trauma, these children had learned to follow instructions in order to survive. Marcus led them out through the side door and into the darkness. The tree line was about 100 yards away, but it felt like a mile. As they moved across the open ground, Marcus used his body to shield the children from the direction of the farmhouse, constantly scanning for signs that they'd been spotted. They were halfway to the trees when disaster struck. One of the men from the farmhouse decided to check on the children, and his shout of alarm echoed across the property when he discovered the unconscious guard and empty cages. "They're gone! The kids are gone!" The man's voice carried clearly in the cold night air, followed immediately by the sound of multiple people running toward the barn. "Run!" Marcus commanded the children. "Run for the trees!" The children, despite their weakened condition, found reserves of strength driven by pure terror. They ran toward the forest as Marcus covered their retreat, placing his massive body between them and the barn. Gunshots erupted behind them as the traffickers realized what was happening. Marcus felt a bullet whip past his head, close enough that he could hear it cut through the air. Another round struck a tree just ahead of them, sending bark flying. Marcus scooped up Lisa, who was struggling to keep pace, and grabbed Tommy's hand, pulling him along faster. "Keep running," he shouted to the other children. "Don't look back." More shots rang out, and Marcus could hear vehicles starting up back at the farm. They would have maybe 2 minutes before the traffickers organized a proper pursuit, and the children needed every second of that head start. They reached the tree line just as Marcus heard the first vehicle racing across the field behind them. The forest provided immediate cover from direct gunfire, but it also slowed their progress. The children were exhausted, and the terrain was rough and unfamiliar. Marcus activated his radio while they pushed deeper into the woods. "Captain Walsh, we're mobile with 6 children, but we're under pursuit. I need that helicopter support now. Helicopters are en route, but it's going to be another 20 minutes. Can you reach the old logging road? That's our best extraction point. Marcus checked his GPS and oriented himself toward the logging road. They were maybe 10 minutes away if they could maintain their current pace. But the children were already showing signs of exhaustion. Behind them, Marcus could hear men crashing through the underbrush, following their trail with flashlights and dogs. The traffickers were organized and determined. They knew that if these children escaped and testified, their entire operation would be exposed. Marcus made a tactical decision that went against every protective instinct he had. He knelt down in front of the children, all of whom were looking at him with absolute trust. "I need you to listen very carefully," he said. "I'm going to show you the path to follow through these woods. It leads to a road where the police are going to pick you up. I need you to take this radio and keep walking in that direction, no matter what happens." "Where are you going?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. "I'm going to make sure the bad men can't follow you," Marcus replied. He handed the radio to Tommy, who seemed like the most capable of the group. "Tommy, you're in charge now. Keep everyone together, and when you reach the road, use this radio to call for help." Marcus pointed out the path they needed to follow, marked by reflective trail markers that would be visible even in the dark. The children understood what he was really saying. He was going to stay behind and face their pursuers alone. "We'll be okay," Sarah said quietly. "Thank you for saving us." Marcus watched the 6 children disappear into the darkness, following the trail toward safety. Then he turned back toward the sounds of pursuit and prepared to buy them the time they needed. The men chasing them had dogs, guns, and local knowledge of the terrain. But Marcus had something they didn't expect: years of experience in these woods, intimate knowledge of every trail and landmark, and a rage that had been building since the moment he first saw Sophie's battered face. Marcus Thompson, the gentle giant who had spent his life avoiding conflict, was about to become something else entirely. He was about to become the thing that stood between innocent children and the monsters who preyed on them, and he was prepared to do whatever it took to make sure those children reached safety. Marcus waited in the darkness, listening to the sounds of his pursuers crashing through the underbrush. They were making too much noise, relying on their numbers and weapons rather than skill. That would be their first mistake. The forest Marcus had chosen for his stand was terrain he knew intimately. Every fallen log, every creek bed, every deer trail had been mapped in his mind during years of hiking and hunting. His pursuers were operating in unfamiliar territory, following flashlight beams that destroyed their night vision and making enough noise to wake half the county. Marcus counted at least 8 men, probably more, spread out in a loose search pattern. They had 2 dogs with them. He could hear the animals straining against their leashes, following the scent trail left by the fleeing children. The men were calling out to each other, coordinating their search with the casual confidence of people who had never faced real opposition. Marcus smiled grimly in the darkness. They were about to learn what opposition looked like. The first trap Marcus had prepared was simple but effective. He'd identified a natural choke point where the trail narrowed between 2 large boulders, forcing anyone following the children's path to pass through a single file. Marcus had strung a wire at ankle height between the rocks, nearly invisible in the darkness. The lead pursuer hit the wire exactly as Marcus had planned. The man went down hard, his flashlight flying into the darkness as he crashed face first into the rocky ground. His cry of pain and surprise caused the other men to converge on his position, bunching up exactly where Marcus wanted them. Marcus triggered the first of his explosive charges, a small device he'd positioned in a dead tree above the choke point. The explosion wasn't designed to kill, but to create chaos and confusion. The tree came crashing down across the trail, blocking the path and separating the pursuers into 2 groups. In the confusion that followed, Marcus struck. He emerged from the darkness behind the 3 men who had been cut off by the fallen tree, moving with the silent efficiency of a predator. The first man never knew what hit him. Marcus's fist connected with the base of his skull, dropping him instantly. The second man managed to turn around before Marcus's massive hand closed around his throat, cutting off his air supply until he lost consciousness. The third man actually managed to draw his weapon, but Marcus was already inside his guard. Marcus twisted the gun away and delivered an uppercut that lifted the man off his feet before depositing him unconscious in a pile of leaves. On the other side of the fallen tree, Marcus could hear the remaining men trying to regroup. Someone was shouting orders, trying to organize a systematic search. Marcus recognized the voice. Sheriff Garrett himself had joined the pursuit. "Spread out," Garrett was yelling. "He's just one man. Find him and put him down." Marcus moved through the forest like a ghost, using every piece of cover and concealment the terrain provided. He'd disabled 3 of his pursuers, but at least 5 remained, including Garrett and what sounded like 2 of his deputies. The dogs were still tracking, following the scent trail toward the logging road where the children were hopefully approaching the extraction point Marcus needed to keep. The pursuers focused on him rather than continuing after the children. That meant making himself a more attractive target. Marcus triggered his second explosive charge, this one positioned near a rocky outcropping about 50 yards from his current position. The blast lit up the night sky and sent echoes rolling through the forest. More importantly, it drew the attention of every man in the search party. "There!" someone shouted. "He's over by Eagle Rock." Marcus heard the men crashing through the underbrush toward the explosion site. While they investigated the decoy, Marcus circled around behind them, moving to a position where he could observe their tactics and plan his next move. What he saw made him recalculate the odds against him. These men weren't just corrupt cops and small-time criminals. They moved with the coordination of people who had worked together in dangerous situations before. Garrett was directing them with hand signals, positioning his men to surround the area where they thought Marcus was hiding. Even more concerning, Marcus spotted something that made his blood run cold. One of the men was carrying what looked like a military-style radio, and he was speaking into it in low, urgent tones. They were calling for backup, probably more corrupt officers from neighboring counties. Or worse, private contractors with military training. Marcus keyed his own radio, keeping his voice barely above a whisper. "Captain Walsh, this is Marcus. The suspects are calling for additional support. You need to accelerate that extraction." Captain Walsh's voice came back tense with concern. "Marcus, our helicopter is 10 minutes out, but we're tracking multiple vehicles converging on your location. How many hostiles are you facing?" "At least 8, probably more coming. And Captain, some of these people have military training. This isn't just a local corruption case." Marcus was beginning to understand the true scope of what he'd stumbled into. This wasn't just Wayne Hutchinson abusing his stepdaughter, or even a small-town sheriff covering up domestic violence. This was an organized criminal enterprise with connections that extended far beyond Millbrook County. His contemplation was interrupted by the sound of an engine, not a car or truck, but something smaller and more agile. Through the trees, Marcus caught a glimpse of headlights moving along one of the old logging roads. Someone was using an ATV to flank his position. Marcus had to move. His current hiding spot was about to be compromised, and the men on foot were closing in from 3 directions. He gathered his remaining equipment and began working his way toward a secondary position he'd identified earlier, a dense thicket near a small creek that would provide both concealment and multiple escape routes. He was halfway there when the dogs found his trail. Marcus heard the animals bay as they caught his scent, followed immediately by the excited shouts of their handlers. The pursuers had been searching somewhat randomly, but now they had a clear trail to follow. Marcus estimated he had maybe 3 minutes before the dogs led the men directly to his position. Marcus reached the creek bed and immediately waded into the icy water. It was a classic evasion technique. Running water would break his scent trail and confuse the dogs. at least temporarily. But it also meant exposing himself in the open as he crossed to the far bank. Marcus was midway across the creek when the ATV burst through the tree line behind him. The rider was wearing night vision goggles and had a rifle mounted on the vehicle's handlebars. He spotted Marcus immediately and brought the weapon to bear. Marcus dove forward just as the rifle cracked. The bullet struck the water where he'd been standing, sending up a geyser of spray. Marcus rolled behind a large boulder on the far bank. As the ATV rider fired again, the bullet striking sparks off the rock inches from his head. The ATV rider was trying to maneuver for a better shot when Marcus implemented the most desperate part of his plan. He'd been saving his largest explosive charge for an emergency, and this definitely qualified. The device was positioned near the creek's edge, where erosion had undermined a large dead oak tree. Marcus triggered the charge remotely. The explosion brought down the entire tree, creating a massive splash as it crashed into the creek. The ATV rider tried to swerve away from the falling timber, but his vehicle hit a hidden root and went tumbling. The rider was thrown clear, landing hard among the rocks and lying still, but the explosion had also revealed Marcus's position to every pursuer in the forest. He could hear men running toward the creek from multiple directions, their flashlights creating a web of moving beams through the trees. Marcus had one advantage left. The terrain around the creek was treacherous in the dark, full of hidden holes and slippery rocks. He knew every foot of it, while his pursuers were operating blind. Marcus led them on a deadly game of cat and mouse through the rocky creek bed. When Deputy Rodriguez appeared at the water's edge, Marcus was waiting behind a waterfall, concealed by the cascade. Rodriguez never saw the massive fist that sent him spinning into unconsciousness. When another man tried to cross the creek using a fallen log, Marcus was positioned beneath the log with a crowbar. A single blow to the man's ankle sent him tumbling into the water with a broken bone and a lot of pain, but Marcus couldn't keep playing defense forever. More men were arriving. He could hear additional vehicles in the distance, and radio chatter was increasing. Soon he would be facing overwhelming numbers, and no amount of tactical advantage could overcome those odds. Marcus's radio crackled with an urgent transmission from Captain Walsh. "Marcus, helicopter is on approach to the extraction point. Do you have eyes on the children?" Marcus climbed to higher ground and used his binoculars to scan toward the logging road. In the distance, he could see the beam of a helicopter searchlight sweeping the area, and small figures moving toward the light. The children had made it to the extraction point. "Confirm children at extraction point," Marcus radioed back. "Helicopters are visible. Roger that. Marcus, we're showing at least 12 additional vehicles en route to your location. You need to extract it now." Marcus looked back toward the creek, where Sheriff Garrett and his remaining men were regrouping for a final assault. Then he looked toward the logging road, where freedom and safety waited. The smart play was to run. He'd accomplished his mission. The children were safe. And staying to fight would only get him killed. But Marcus had learned something about himself over the past 2 days. He wasn't the kind of man who could walk away while monsters like Hutchinson and Garrett remained free to hurt others. He wasn't the kind of man who could let corruption and evil triumph just because fighting back was dangerous. Marcus keyed his radio one final time. "Captain Walsh, the children are your priority. Get them to safety. I'm going to keep these people busy until your tactical team arrives. Marcus, don't be a hero. You've done enough." Marcus smiled grimly in the darkness. "I'm not being a hero, Captain. I'm being what these people made me become." Marcus checked his remaining equipment, one explosive charge, various tools that could serve as weapons, and his own massive strength and intimate knowledge of the terrain. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. In the distance, he could hear the helicopter lifting off with its precious cargo of rescued children. Sophie and her half-sister Lisa were finally safe. along with 4 other children who had been given up for dead by their family's dad. Now it was time to make sure that Wayne Hutchinson, Sheriff Garrett, and their entire criminal organization paid the price for what they'd done. Marcus Thompson, who had started this journey as a man who just wanted to be left alone, was about to finish it as something else entirely, the avenging angel that monsters saw in their nightmares. The reinforcements arrived faster than Marcus had anticipated. Through his binoculars, he watched a convoy of black SUVs pull up to the Hartwell farm, disgorging men in tactical gear who moved with military precision. These weren't local corrupt cops. These were professionals, probably ex-military contractors, hired to clean up the trafficking operations exposure. Marcus counted at least 15 new arrivals, all carrying assault rifles and wearing night vision equipment. They immediately began establishing a perimeter around the forest, cutting off his escape routes with the efficiency of people who had done this kind of operation before. But Marcus had spent the last hour preparing for exactly this scenario. While Sheriff Garrett's men had been stumbling through the woods, Marcus had been setting up what construction workers called controlled demolition zone, a carefully planned series of explosive charges that would reshape the battlefield. To his advantage, Marcus keyed his radio to Captain Walsh's frequency. "Captain, I'm seeing military-grade opposition here. This trafficking ring has serious backing." "Marcus, my tactical team is 15 minutes out, but what you're describing sounds like we're going to need federal support. Can you identify any of these contractors?" Marcus adjusted his binoculars, focusing on the men deploying around the perimeter. One figure caught his attention, a tall man with graying hair who was directing the operation with hand signals. Marcus had seen that face before, years ago, in newspaper articles about a private military company called Blackwater Security. "Captain, I think we're dealing with Orion Strategic Solutions," Marcus whispered into his radio. "I recognize the team leader, former Blackwater operative named Vincent Reyes. These people don't just traffic children, they provide security for people who do." The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. This wasn't just a local corruption case, or even a regional trafficking ring. This was part of a network that probably extended to wealthy and powerful people who could afford to hire military contractors to protect their illegal activities. Marcus's contemplation was interrupted by movement in the woods below him. 3 of the professional operators were advancing up the hillside, using proper tactical spacing and communication. Unlike Sheriff Garrett's men, these people knew how to hunt someone in hostile terrain. Marcus triggered his first prepared charge, a device he'd placed near a natural rockslide area above the advancing team. The explosion didn't just create noise and confusion. It started an actual avalanche of loose stone and debris that came cascading down the hillside. The 3 operators dove for cover, but the rockslide was too wide to avoid completely. Marcus heard pained shouts as rocks the size of basketballs bounced and rolled through their position. 2 of the men were injured badly enough to require evacuation, while the 3rd was pinned down behind inadequate cover. The avalanche had an unexpected secondary effect. It blocked one of the main access routes up the hillside, forcing the other teams to take longer, more exposed paths to reach Marcus's position. Marcus used the confusion to relocate to his secondary fighting position, a natural cave system he'd discovered years earlier while exploring the area. The cave had multiple entrances and a complex internal layout that would neutralize the operators. Numerical advantage. As Marcus moved through the forest, he caught fragments of radio chatter from the professionals below. They were coordinating with someone called Control, reporting on the tactical situation and requesting additional assets. Most disturbing, Marcus heard references to Package 7 and immediate termination protocols. Package 7 could only refer to the children who had been extracted. Even now, with the kids safely in state police custody, someone was planning to eliminate them before they could testify. Marcus realized that rescuing the children had only been the first phase of this, but keeping them alive long enough to expose the entire network would be the real challenge. Marcus reached the cave system and immediately began implementing his defensive strategy. He'd spent years exploring these caves and had cached supplies in several locations. More importantly, he knew about the underground river that connected this cave system to others throughout the county, a natural escape route that his pursuers couldn't possibly know about. The first professional team reached the cave entrance just as Marcus was finishing his preparations. These operators moved with textbook precision, using hand signals and coordinated movement to clear the entrance without exposing themselves unnecessarily. Marcus let them enter the cave, waiting until all 4 men were inside before triggering his next surprise. He'd positioned mirrors throughout the cave system to redirect sunlight during the day, but at night they served a different purpose. Marcus activated a powerful LED spotlight positioned deep in the cave, and the mirrors reflected and amplified the light into a blinding strobe effect that destroyed the operator's night vision. In the confusion that followed, Marcus struck from the shadows. His construction background had taught him to move safely in confined spaces with poor visibility. While the operators were stumbling around blind and disoriented, Marcus's first target never saw him coming. The operator was swept off his feet by a massive arm that appeared out of the darkness, his night vision goggles flying across the cave as he slammed into the rock wall. The second operator tried to bring his rifle to bear, but Marcus was already inside his guard, one massive hand closing around the weapon's barrel while the other delivered a blow that sent the man spinning into unconsciousness. The third and fourth operators retreated toward the cave entrance, firing blindly into the darkness. Their muzzle flashes destroyed what remained of their night vision while revealing their positions to Marcus, who had closed his eyes before triggering the light show. Marcus pursued them toward the entrance, using the cave's irregular floor and low ceiling to his advantage. The operators couldn't use their superior firepower effectively in the confined space, and their tactical training was designed for open combat, not underground warfare. By the time the surviving operators reached the cave entrance, only one was still conscious and capable of fighting. Marcus let him escape, knowing that the man would report back to his team leader with valuable intelligence, that the target was no longer running or hiding, but actively hunting them. Marcus used the underground river to relocate to a different part of the cave system, emerging near a rock formation that gave him a commanding view of the entire forest. From this position, he could see the professionals regrouping around their vehicles, clearly reassessing their tactics. Vincent Reyes himself was now in the field, directing his remaining operators with the calm efficiency of someone accustomed to difficult assignments. Marcus watched him deploy his men in a wider perimeter, positioning snipers on high ground and establishing overwatch positions that would make movement through the forest extremely dangerous. But Reyes had made one critical mistake. He was treating this like a conventional military operation, assuming that his opponent would follow predictable tactical patterns. Marcus wasn't a soldier or a trained operative. He was a construction worker who understood demolition, terrain modification, and industrial problem-solving. Marcus activated his radio for what he suspected might be his final transmission to Captain Walsh. "Captain, the professionals are regrouping. I count at least 12 still operational, with sniper support and heavy weapons. But I've got one more card to play." "Marcus, my team is 8 minutes out. Can you hold that long?" Marcus looked at his final explosive charge, the largest device he'd prepared, positioned near an old mining operation that had been abandoned decades earlier. The mine had been used to extract limestone for road construction, and the quarry was filled with unstable rock formations that had been weakened by years of blasting. "Captain, when your team arrives, make sure they approach from the east side of the valley. The west side is going to be temporarily unavailable." Marcus didn't wait for a response. He was already moving toward the mining area where Vincent Reyes and his operators were establishing their command post. They'd chosen the location because it offered excellent visibility and fields of fire, never suspecting that the entire hillside above them was essentially a controlled demolition. Waiting to happen. Marcus reached his final fighting position just as the professionals began their coordinated assault on the cave system. They moved in perfect formation, each team covering the others as they advanced up the hillside. It was a textbook operation that would have been devastatingly effective against any conventional opponent. Marcus triggered his final charge. The explosion wasn't just loud, it was geological. Decades of mining operations had created a network of stress fractures throughout the limestone hillside, and Marcus's charge was positioned at the exact point where those fractures intersected. The hillside didn't just collapse. It liquefied, turning into an avalanche of mud, rock, and debris that consumed everything in its path. Vincent Reyes and his command post disappeared under tons of moving earth. The professional operators who had been advancing up the hillside found themselves running for their lives as the very ground beneath their feet gave way. Some made it to safety. Others were buried under the largest man-made landslide in Millbrook County's history. Marcus rode the edge of the avalanche down into the valley, using his knowledge of the terrain to stay ahead of the worst of the debris flow. When it finally stopped, the entire western side of the valley had been reshaped, and the Hartwell farm was buried under 20 feet of mud and rock. Marcus emerged from the devastation, covered in dirt and debris but essentially unharmed. The silence that followed the avalanche was deafening. No gunfire, no radio chatter, no sounds of pursuit. For the first time in hours, Marcus was alone in the forest. Marcus activated his radio one final time. "Captain Walsh, this is Marcus. The immediate threat has been neutralized. But you need to understand, this trafficking network extends far beyond Millbrook County. The people funding it hired military contractors to clean up their mess. The children you extracted are still in danger." Captain Walsh's voice came back, filled with relief and amazement. "Marcus, we can see the results of your demolition work. My tactical team is moving in now to secure the area. And Marcus, federal agencies are already mobilizing based on your intelligence. This is going to be the largest human trafficking investigation in Pennsylvania's history." Marcus began walking toward the rendezvous point where Captain Walsh's team was establishing their command post. Behind him, the destroyed Hartwell farm and the buried command post served as monuments to what happened when good people decided to fight back against evil. But Marcus knew the real battle was just beginning. Somewhere out there, wealthy and powerful people were already working to cover their tracks, eliminate witnesses, and rebuild their criminal network. The children were safe for now, but keeping them safe would require constant vigilance. As he walked through the forest toward an uncertain future, Marcus Thompson reflected on how much his life had changed in just 3 days. He'd started as a man who wanted nothing more than to be left alone in his cabin, working with his hands and avoiding the complexities of the world. Now he was something else entirely, a man who had stared into the abyss of human evil and decided to fight back, regardless of the personal cost. The gentle giant was gone forever, replaced by someone harder, more dangerous, but ultimately more necessary. Because sometimes when the system fails and innocent people suffer, ordinary citizens have to become extraordinary. Sometimes, the only thing standing between children and monsters is one person willing to say no more and mean it. Marcus Thompson had become that person, and he would never be the same again. 3 months later, Marcus Thompson sat in a federal courthouse in Philadelphia, watching as the final defendant in what had become known as the Millbrook Conspiracy was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The man being led away in shackles was Senator Richard Blackwood, whose private estate had served as the hub for a trafficking network that spanned 6 states and had operated for over a decade. the investigation that began with Marcus finding Sophie in the snow had ultimately exposed one of the largest child trafficking operations in American history. The network had included corrupt law enforcement officials, wealthy business leaders, politicians, and even federal judges. Wayne Hutchinson, it turned out, had been nothing more than a low-level operator in an organization that had victimized hundreds of children. Marcus watched the proceedings from the gallery, sitting next to Captain Jennifer Walsh, who had been promoted to major following her role in breaking the case. Beside them sat Dr. Sarah Chen, a federal prosecutor who had spent the last 3 months building an airtight case against the trafficking network. 47 convictions, Dr. Chen said quietly as Senator Blackwood was led away. Life sentences for 12 of them, including the senator. I've never seen a case with this level of coordination and evidence. Marcus nodded, but his attention was focused on the small group of children sitting in the front row of the gallery. Sophie and her half-sister Lisa were there, along with Tommy Carlisle, Emma Rodriguez, Michael Chun, and Sarah Williams. The 6 children Marcus had rescued from the barn at Hartwell Farm. They had all testified during the various trials, showing remarkable courage as they faced their former captors in court. Sophie looked different now. The bruises had healed months ago, and she'd gained weight and grown taller. More importantly, the haunted look in her eyes had been replaced by something Marcus had never expected to see: hope. She was living with a foster family in Pittsburgh, far from Millbrook County, and attending therapy sessions that were helping her process the trauma she'd endured. Mr. Thompson? A voice behind Marcus made him turn around. It was Agent Lisa Martinez from the FBI's Crimes Against Children unit, who had coordinated much of the federal investigation. There's someone who wants to meet you. Agent Martinez led Marcus to a conference room where a woman in her 50s was waiting. She had graying hair and tired eyes, but when she saw Marcus, her face lit up with gratitude. Mr. Thompson, I'm Patricia Carlisle, the woman said, standing up to shake his massive hand. Tommy's grandmother. I don't know how to thank you for bringing my grandson home. Marcus knelt down so he was at eye level with Mrs. Carlisle. You don't need to thank me. Tommy's a brave kid. He took care of the other children during their escape, just like I asked him to. Mrs. Carlisle's eyes filled with tears. The doctors say he's going to be okay. It'll take time, but he's resilient. They all are. And that's because of what you did. Similar conversations had been happening for months as Marcus met with the families of the rescued children. Each reunion was bittersweet, joy at having their children returned, mixed with grief for the innocence that had been stolen from them. But the children were survivors, and with proper care and support, they were healing. The investigation had revealed the true scope of what Marcus had stumbled into that snowy February night. The trafficking network had operated for over 15 years, using a combination of kidnapping, family coercion, and exploitation of vulnerable children in the foster care system. The operation had been protected by corrupt officials at every level of government, from local sheriffs to federal judges. Wayne Hutchinson had been one of many recruiters who identified and acquired children for the network. His marriage to Sophie's mother had been arranged specifically to give him access to Sophie and Lisa, both of whom had been selected for their vulnerability and isolation. The car accident during the blizzard had been Hutchinson attempting to transport Sophie to a processing facility where she would have disappeared forever. The financial investigation had been equally shocking. The trafficking network had generated hundreds of millions of dollars over its operational lifetime, with proceeds flowing to a network of wealthy clients who paid premium prices for access to children. Some of the most respected names in business and politics had been exposed as participants or facilitators. Sheriff Garrett had survived the avalanche at Hartwell Farm, along with 2 of his deputies. All 3 were now serving life sentences in federal prison. Vincent Reyes, the Orion Strategic Solutions operative, had not been so fortunate. His body had been recovered from the debris field 3 weeks after the avalanche. But the most satisfying conviction, from Marcus's perspective, had been Wayne Hutchinson himself. The man who had terrorized Sophie and Lisa for years was now locked away in a supermax facility, where he would spend the rest of his life in solitary confinement. Justice had finally caught up with him. As the courthouse emptied after the final sentencing, Marcus found himself alone with Sophie and Lisa in the hallway. The girls had grown close to him over the months, seeing him as the protector who had saved their lives when no one else would help. "Marcus," Sophie said, tugging on his jacket, "Mrs. Patterson says we might be able to visit you this summer." Mrs. Patterson was their foster mother, a kind woman who had opened her home to both girls and was helping them rebuild their lives. She understood the importance of maintaining their connection to the man who had rescued them. "I'd like that," Marcus said, kneeling down to hug both girls. "I'm building a playground behind my new cabin. I thought you might like to help me design it." Marcus's old cabin had been destroyed during the investigation, partly by the firefight with Hutchinson's people, and partly by the media attention that had followed the case. He'd used the insurance money and a substantial reward from the federal government to build a new home on the other side of Pine Ridge, where he could have privacy while still remaining accessible to the children and families who had become part of his extended community. Lisa, who had been mostly silent during the court proceedings, suddenly spoke up. "Marcus, are the bad people really gone forever?" It was a question Marcus had been asked many times over the past 3 months, and he'd learned to answer it honestly while still providing comfort. "The people who hurt you are gone forever," he said gently. "But there are other bad people in the world, and good people have to keep watching out for them. That's why we have police officers like Captain Walsh, and prosecutors like Dr. Chun, and investigators like Agent Martinez." "And people like you?" Sophie asked. Marcus smiled. "I hope there won't need to be people like me. I hope the system will work the way it's supposed to, so regular people don't have to do what I did." But even as he said it, Marcus knew that wasn't entirely true. The system had failed spectacularly in Millbrook County, and it was only through extraordinary individual action that the trafficking network had been exposed. There would always be a need for people willing to stand up to evil, regardless of the personal cost. As the girls left with their foster mother, Marcus walked outside into the Philadelphia sunshine. The city was bustling with normal life, people going to work, children playing in parks, families living in safety and security. It was the kind of normalcy that the rescued children were slowly learning to trust again. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. He almost deleted it without reading, but something made him open it instead. "Mr. Thompson, you don't know me, but I work for the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. We have a situation in Ohio that might require your unique skills. Are you interested in helping more children?" Marcus stared at the message for a long moment. Part of him wanted to return to his quiet life in the woods, to go back to building cabinets and avoiding the complexities of the world. He'd done his part, saved the children he'd found, and helped bring down a massive criminal network. But another part of him, the part that had emerged during those 3 days in February, knew that he couldn't turn away from children in danger. Not when he had proven that one determined person could make a difference against overwhelming odds. Marcus typed back a simple response: "Tell me about the situation." Within minutes, his phone rang. The caller was Agent Rebecca Torres from the National Center, and she had a story that was disturbingly familiar: missing children, local law enforcement that seemed uninterested in investigating, and wealthy, powerful people who appeared to be protected from scrutiny. "Mr. Thompson, I know this is a lot to ask," Agent Torres said. "You've already done more than anyone could expect. But we have reason to believe there's another network operating in rural Ohio, and the local authorities are either incompetent or compromised. We need someone who can operate outside official channels, someone who has experience with this kind of situation. Marcus looked back at the courthouse where justice had finally been served for Sophie, Lisa, and the other children. Then he thought about unknown children somewhere in Ohio who might be suffering right now, waiting for someone to care enough to help them. "Agent Torres, send me everything you have," Marcus said. "I'll be on the road to Ohio tonight." Marcus Thompson had discovered something about himself during those 3 days in February that would define the rest of his life. He wasn't just a gentle giant who wanted to be left alone. He was a protector, a guardian, a man who would stand between innocent children and the monsters who preyed on them. The boy who had grown up differently, who had been isolated by his extraordinary size, had found his calling in the most unlikely way possible. He had become exactly what the world needed him to be, not in spite of his differences, but because of them. As Marcus drove out of Philadelphia toward his next mission, he thought about the lesson that Sophie had taught him without even realizing it. Sometimes the most vulnerable people in society, children, the disabled, those who are different, possess a strength and resilience that puts the rest of us to shame. They survive horrors that would break most adults, and they continue to hope and trust and love despite everything they've endured. Marcus Thompson had spent most of his life feeling like an outsider, someone too big and too different to fit into normal society. But he'd learned that being different wasn't a weakness, it was exactly what made him capable of doing things that others couldn't do. The giant who had found the beaten girl in the snow had become something more than he'd ever imagined possible. He'd become a force for justice in a world that desperately needed people willing to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. And somewhere in Ohio, unknown children were about to discover that they weren't alone, that someone was coming for them, someone who would never give up and never back down. Marcus Thompson was coming, and the monsters should be afraid, because giants, when they finally decide to fight, are truly a force to be reckoned with. 5 years had passed since that February night when Marcus Thompson first heard a cry for help in the blizzard. The man who pulled into the driveway of a modest house in suburban Pittsburgh bore little resemblance to the isolated hermit who had once lived alone in the Pennsylvania mountains. Marcus stepped out of his specially modified truck, ducking slightly to clear the doorframe. His hair had more gray in it now, and his face carried new lines earned through years of dangerous work. But his eyes held something they'd never possessed before that snowy night, a sense of purpose that ran deeper than bone. The front door of the house burst open before Marcus could knock, and Sophie Brennan launched herself into his arms. At 13, she'd grown tall and confident, her dark hair braided with colorful ribbons and her smile bright enough to power the neighborhood. The broken, terrified 8-year-old Marcus had found in the snow existed now only in court records and therapy files. "Marcus, you came." Sophie's voice carried the joy of a child who had learned to trust that the people she loved would keep their promises. "Did you think I'd miss your graduation?" Marcus replied, setting her gently on the ground. "8th grade is a big deal." Lisa emerged from the house more cautiously, as was her nature. Now 11, she'd grown into a thoughtful, artistic child who expressed her healing through watercolor paintings that hung throughout the foster home. She hugged Marcus with the fierce loyalty of someone who remembered being saved. "Mrs. Patterson made your favorite cookies," Lisa said. "The ones with the chocolate chips that are as big as quarters." Margaret Patterson appeared in the doorway, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. At 62, she'd fostered dozens of children over the years, but Sophie and Lisa held special places in her heart. She'd watched them transform from traumatized survivors into thriving young women, and she understood the crucial role Marcus had played in that transformation. "Marcus Thompson, you get yourself in here right now," Mrs. Patterson called with mock sternness. "Those girls have been watching the window for an hour waiting for you." The house buzzed with the comfortable chaos of family life. Homework scattered across the kitchen table, art projects taped to the refrigerator, And the lingering scent of homemade dinner created an atmosphere of safety and normalcy that would have been unimaginable 5 years earlier. Marcus settled into a reinforced chair that Mrs. Patterson had purchased specifically for his visits, listening as Sophie chatted about her classes, her friends, and her plans for high school. She wanted to study criminal justice, inspired by the prosecutors and FBI agents she'd met during the trials. Lisa, quieter but equally determined, planned to become an art therapist to help other children process trauma. "Tell us about the case." "In Montana," Sophie demanded, her eyes bright with curiosity. "The news said you found 12 kids in that compound." Marcus had continued working with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, becoming their unofficial specialist in impossible situations. Over 5 years, he'd been involved in 17 major operations, helping to rescue over 200 children from various trafficking networks, cult compounds, and abusive situations. Each case had its own challenges, but Marcus had developed a reputation for succeeding where traditional law enforcement couldn't operate. The Montana case was different, Marcus said carefully. He'd learned to share age-appropriate details with Sophie and Lisa, understanding that their questions came from a need to process their own experiences rather than mere curiosity. It was a religious cult that had cut itself off from the outside world. The children there had never known anything different, so convincing them to leave was harder than breaking down the gates. "But you got them all out safely?" Lisa asked. "Every single one. They're living with families now, learning about the real world. Some of them are having a hard time adjusting, but they're getting help." What Marcus didn't mention was how the Montana operation had nearly cost him his life. The cult leader had been a former military officer with extensive combat training, and the compound had been booby-trapped with improvised explosive devices. Marcus had spent 3 days in a medically induced coma after the final confrontation. But he'd kept his promise to bring every child home alive. Mrs. Patterson served dinner, while the girls peppered Marcus with questions about his travels, his work, and the children he'd helped. They maintained correspondence with several of the kids from other cases, creating an informal network of survivors who supported each other through the challenges of healing and growing up. After dinner, Marcus stepped outside with Mrs. Patterson, while the girls finished their homework. The evening air was cool and pleasant, a stark contrast to that brutal February night that had changed all their lives. "They're doing well," Mrs. Patterson said, watching through the window as Sophie helped. "Lisa with a math problem. Really well. The nightmares are rare now, and they're both making friends at school. But they still need to know you're out there, fighting for other children." Marcus nodded. The psychological experts had explained that Sophie and Lisa's recovery was partly dependent on their belief that other children would be protected from what they'd experienced. Knowing that Marcus continued his work gave them a sense that their suffering had meaning beyond their own survival. "How are you holding up?" Mrs. Patterson asked gently. "You look tired." Marcus was tired. 5 years of dangerous operations had taken their toll on his body and his spirit. He'd been shot twice, stabbed once, and caught in more explosions than he cared to count. The physical scars were manageable, but the emotional weight of seeing what human beings could do to innocent children was harder to bear. "I'm okay," Marcus said. "This helps, seeing them happy and safe. It reminds me why the work matters. You know you don't have to save every child in the world, right?" Mrs. Patterson's voice carried the gentle concern of someone who'd watched him carry increasingly heavy burdens. "You've already done more than anyone could ask." Marcus was quiet for a moment, watching Sophie and Lisa through the window. They were laughing about something, heads bent together over their homework in the unconscious intimacy of sisters. 5 years ago, they'd been broken, terrified children with no hope and no future. Now they were thriving young women with dreams and ambitions and the confidence to pursue them. "I got a call yesterday," Marcus said finally. "There's a situation in Nevada. Remote ranch, children who haven't been seen in months, local authorities who seem reluctant to investigate. Mrs. Patterson sighed. "When do you leave?" "Tomorrow morning. But I wanted to see Sophie graduate first." The graduation ceremony the next day was held in the school gymnasium, packed with proud families celebrating their children's transition to high school. Marcus sat in the back, his size making him conspicuous despite his efforts to blend in. When Sophie's name was called, she walked across the stage with confidence, accepting her diploma, with a smile that could have lit the entire building. But it was what happened next that would stay with Marcus forever. Instead of returning to her seat, Sophie walked to the microphone. "I'd like to thank someone special," she said, her young voice carrying clearly through the gymnasium. "5 years ago, a man named Marcus Thompson saved my life and the lives of several other children. He didn't have to help us, but he did anyway, because he believes that every child deserves to be safe and loved." The audience turned to look at Marcus, who felt his face burning with embarrassment and pride. Sophie continued, undaunted by the attention. "Mr. Thompson taught me that being different isn't something to be ashamed of. It's something that can make you special. He's different because he's bigger and stronger than most people, and he uses those differences to protect children who can't protect themselves. I want to be like him when I grow up. Not big and strong, I'll never be that, but brave enough to stand up for people who need help." The gymnasium erupted in applause, and Marcus found himself wiping away tears he hadn't expected. Sophie had articulated something he'd never been able to put into words, that his differences, which had isolated him for most of his life, had ultimately become his greatest strength. Later, as Marcus prepared to leave for Nevada, Sophie and Lisa walked him to his truck. They'd done this dozens of times over the years, understanding that each departure might be the last time they saw him. "Be careful," Lisa said, hugging him tightly. "The kids in Nevada need you to come back safe." "I will," Marcus promised, meaning it with every fiber of his being. Sophie stood on her tiptoes to whisper in his ear, "Thank you for showing me that. Monsters can be beaten. When I become a prosecutor, I'm going to put away every bad person I can find." Marcus drove away from Pittsburgh as the sun set behind him, heading west toward Nevada and another group of children who needed someone willing to fight for them. In his rearview mirror, he could see Sophie and Lisa waving from the front porch, two survivors who had become symbols of hope and resilience. 5 years ago, Marcus Thompson had been a lonely giant who just wanted to be left alone, a chance encounter. During a blizzard had revealed his true calling, not despite his differences, but because of them. He'd learned that sometimes the people society overlooks or fears are exactly the ones it needs most. The road stretched out ahead, leading to another battle against another network of monsters who preyed on innocent children. Marcus wasn't afraid anymore. He'd found his place in the world, his reason for being different, his answer to the question of why he'd been made so much larger and stronger than other people. He was a giant, and giants were meant to fight monsters, somewhere in Nevada. Children were waiting for rescue, though they didn't know it yet. But Marcus Thompson was coming for them, carrying 5 years of experience, an unbreakable determination, and the love of 2 little girls who had taught him that hope could survive anything. The gentle giant was gone forever, replaced by something far more powerful, a guardian angel who happened to be 7 feet tall and completely, utterly unstoppable when children were in danger. Marcus smiled as he drove into the gathering darkness, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, and new opportunities to prove that one person really could make a difference in the world. After all, he was living proof of it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.